The community theater director. Most theater volunteers didn't notice how the director's eyes tracked financial discrepancies that seemed like normal budget variations, or how he positioned himself to observe board meetings where grant allocations were discussed. They just wanted to create beautiful productions. They had no idea the man leading their theater once investigated funding fraud that destroyed arts programs across entire regions. Welcome to the Human Stories. Before we begin this powerful story of protecting arts funding from those who would steal from community enrichment, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. These stories matter. Riverside Community Theater had been serving the downtown arts district for 12 years, transforming a converted warehouse into a cultural hub where local actors, musicians, and artists could create productions that brought education, entertainment, and community pride to neighborhoods that often lacked access to professional cultural programs. The theater operated on a combination of ticket sales, private donations, and public grants designed to support arts education in underserved communities. David Chen had been directing the theater for 5 years, managing everything from casting decisions to budget allocations while ensuring that the theater provided high-quality productions that were accessible to families regardless of their economic circumstances. At 63, he looked exactly like what he claimed to be, a retired arts administrator who had discovered his passion for community theater and wanted to use his management experience to support local cultural programs. But David's attention to financial management went far beyond normal nonprofit administration. While most theater directors focused on artistic vision, volunteer coordination, and audience development, David automatically monitored grant expenditures, funding allocations, and administrative costs with the trained eye of someone who understood how public arts funding could be diverted from community programs to personal enrichment. What the theater volunteers didn't know was that David Chen had never been an arts administrator. For 19 years, he'd been Inspector David Chen, Public Funding Fraud Division, specializing in grant fraud investigations, nonprofit embezzlement cases, and situations where criminals used arts organizations, educational programs, and community services as fronts for stealing public money intended to benefit the populations those programs were supposed to serve. His retirement 5 years ago had been earned through nearly 2 decades of investigating fraud that destroyed community programs. His ability to recognize funding fraud patterns had been permanent. "Great rehearsal tonight," said Jennifer Martinez, the volunteer coordinator who managed the theater's education outreach programs. "The kids from Roosevelt Elementary are so excited about performing in our youth production." "They should be proud," David replied, but his attention was on the financial reports that showed grant money allocated for youth programming being redirected to administrative costs that didn't align with legitimate theater operations. What bothered David wasn't normal budget adjustments. Community theaters often needed flexibility in allocating resources to meet changing programming needs. What concerned him was the pattern of grant fund diversions that suggested systematic embezzlement rather than legitimate administrative necessities. Over the next month, David found himself conducting the kind of financial analysis that had characterized his fraud investigation career. Not obvious auditing, just the systematic examination of spending patterns that distinguished legitimate nonprofit management from criminal exploitation of public arts funding. The discrepancies were becoming clear. Grant money specifically allocated for community education programs was being redirected to personal expenses disguised as administrative costs. Equipment purchases that should have supported theater operations were generating receipts for items that never arrived at the theater. And most concerning, David recognized the specific accounting techniques he'd seen in embezzlement investigations, public money being stolen from programs designed to serve children and low-income families. "David," said Robert Kim, the theater board chairman, "we need to discuss some budget adjustments for next quarter. The State Arts Council is asking for detailed expenditure reports on our community outreach grants." David had prepared hundreds of grant compliance reports during his fraud investigation career, usually as evidence in criminal cases where nonprofit organizations had stolen public money intended for community services. "I'll review the allocations," David said, though he already knew that the expenditure patterns would show systematic diversion of grant funds from their intended purposes. That evening, David did something he hadn't done since his official retirement. He called a number that connected him to people who still investigated the crimes he'd once specialized in preventing. Public Funding Fraud Division, Investigator Angela Rodriguez speaking. "Angela, this is David Chen." There was a pause. "David, how's the theater world treating you?" "Dramatically," David said, sitting at his home office with financial records and grant documents that looked like normal nonprofit administration, but represented potential evidence of systematic public funding fraud. "Angela, I need to report suspected grant fraud involving arts funding embezzlement." Investigator Rodriguez had worked with David for 8 years before his retirement. She knew that when David Chen called about suspected grant fraud, it meant public money intended for community programs was being stolen by people who exploited the trust of organizations designed to serve vulnerable populations. "What are you seeing?" David provided details with the precision that had made him legendary in public funding fraud investigations. Financial patterns, allocation discrepancies, embezzlement indicators, and accounting techniques that suggested organized theft of grant money rather than legitimate nonprofit financial management. "David," Rodriguez said after he finished, "we'll coordinate with State Arts Council and nonprofit oversight divisions. Can you maintain normal operations while we develop the investigation?" "Affirmative," David said, "but they're accelerating the embezzlement. Based on the spending patterns and grant cycle timing, they're planning to steal the entire annual community outreach allocation before the next audit period." What happened next was 19 years of public funding fraud expertise compressed into the most important theater season of David's civilian life. He returned to Riverside Community Theater the following week, not just as a director managing artistic productions, but as an experienced investigator conducting surveillance in an environment where criminals thought their grant fraud was invisible among legitimate nonprofit administration. Over the next 2 months, David coordinated with Investigator Rodriguez's team to document comprehensive grant fraud involving embezzlement, falsified expense reports, and systematic theft of public money intended to provide arts education to children and cultural programming to underserved communities. "We've arrested 4 suspects, including 2 board members," Rodriguez told him during a briefing at the theater after the operation concluded. The embezzlement network was stealing over $200,000 annually from state and federal arts grants while filing false reports that claimed the money was being used for community programming. "Impact on the arts programs?" David asked. "The stolen funding was supposed to provide free theater education to over 300 children from low-income families and support cultural programming in neighborhoods that lacked access to arts enrichment. Your identification of the fraud pattern prevented the complete destruction of community arts funding for the entire region." The investigation revealed that the grant fraud network had been operating for over 3 years, systematically stealing public money intended for arts education while filing false reports that claimed successful community programming that never actually occurred. Local news covered the story as a major nonprofit fraud bust by state funding oversight authorities, with no mention of the theater director who had recognized the embezzlement patterns or the public funding fraud veteran who had provided the expertise that protected arts programming for vulnerable communities. A few weeks later, the State Arts Council approached David about developing enhanced oversight protocols for community arts organizations. "Mr. Chen," said Arts Council Director Patricia Williams, "we understand you have extensive experience in nonprofit financial management." David looked around the Riverside Community Theater, where children from low-income families were rehearsing for productions that would give them confidence and creative skills, where families could enjoy professional quality entertainment they could afford, and where grant money was actually being used to enrich communities rather than enrich criminals. "Some," he said simply, "we'd like to implement stronger oversight procedures for arts grant administration. Would you be willing to help develop those protocols?" "Of course," David replied. "Public arts funding exists to serve communities, especially children and families who depend on grant-supported programs for access to cultural enrichment that they couldn't otherwise afford." What the Arts Council director didn't know was that she'd just asked one of the region's most experienced public funding fraud investigators to design oversight systems for protecting arts grants from exactly the kind of embezzlement David had spent his career fighting. David never told theater volunteers about his fraud investigation background or the embezzlement networks he'd dismantled. He never mentioned the grant fraud schemes he'd prosecuted or the nonprofit organizations he'd helped expose for stealing public money intended for community services. He just directed community theater productions every season, managed legitimate arts programming, and quietly watched for financial patterns that indicated criminals were stealing grant money from programs designed to serve children and vulnerable families. But word spread through arts administration circles that if anyone noticed unusual financial patterns or suspected grant fraud at community organizations, they should probably consult with the director at Riverside Community Theater, not officially, of course, just as a professional courtesy to someone who understood how public funding fraud operations worked. Every season, David continued his work. He directed productions that brought joy and education to the community, managed legitimate grant funding to maximize community benefit, and monitored the theater's operations with the kind of vigilant oversight that had kept him at the forefront of fraud investigation for nearly 2 decades. Most seasons, the biggest challenge was balancing artistic vision with budget limitations while ensuring that programming served the community's needs. But some seasons, when his trained instincts detected financial patterns that indicated grant fraud, David Chen was exactly where he needed to be, between public arts funding and criminals who would steal money intended for community enrichment. Because that's what you do when you've spent your career investigating public funding fraud. You don't stop protecting community programs when you retire. You just find a new way to ensure that grant money serves the communities it was intended to benefit. And sometimes, the most important arts funding protection in a region is provided by someone who looks like they're just trying to create beautiful theater productions, but who knows exactly what grant fraud looks like and refuses to let criminals steal from community arts programs. David had spent 19 years investigating fraud that destroyed community programs by stealing public money intended for education, arts, and social services. Now he spent his retirement ensuring that one community theater remained a place where grant funding actually served children and families rather than enriching embezzlers who exploited public trust. The mission was the same. The funding was the same. The only difference was that now, instead of investigating grant fraud after community programs were destroyed, he was preventing embezzlement by recognizing the patterns before criminals could steal money intended for arts education and cultural enrichment. And every season, as children performed with confidence and families enjoyed affordable cultural programming, David Chen worked with the eyes and experience of someone who knew the difference between legitimate nonprofit administration and criminal theft of public funding, ready to protect both the arts programs and the communities that depended on grant money being used for its intended purpose. So the next time you attend a community theater production or volunteer for a local arts organization, remember that the person managing the program might have expertise far beyond artistic administration. The director ensuring your community benefits from arts funding might be the same person who spent their career investigating criminals who steal public money from programs designed to serve children and vulnerable families. Have you ever met someone like David? Someone whose retirement work perfectly positioned them to protect community programs using their professional expertise? Share their story in the comments below. Tell us about the quiet professionals who never stop ensuring that public funding serves communities rather than enriching criminals. Thank you for watching The Human Stories. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it with someone who believes in protecting arts funding from embezzlement. Because the world needs more people like David Chen, professionals who understand that some protection is too important to end with retirement. Until next time, remember that guardians come in all forms. Sometimes they wear investigator badges and prosecute grant fraud. Sometimes they direct community theater and monitor arts funding. But they're always protecting public programs from criminal exploitation, always ensuring that grant money serves communities rather than criminals. And sometimes the most important funding protection in your community comes from someone who spent their career learning exactly how public money gets stolen and refuses to let embezzlers operate in any organization he leads.